Your algorithm is interesting, Sarah, but it's not market-ready, my co-founder said, dismissing my presentation in front of our Series A investors. The investors nodded thoughtfully. My co-founder, Ryan Chen, smiled confidently and opened his own presentation. Let me show you what I've been developing that will actually scale. I sat at the conference table in the venture capital firm's downtown office, watching Ryan present a product roadmap based entirely on code I'd written over the past 18 months. The architecture was mine. The optimization techniques were mine. Even the specific implementation approaches came directly from technical specifications I'd shared with him during our weekly engineering reviews. This was the 11th time in 20 months that Ryan had stolen my code and presented it as his own work to investors, potential clients, or tech journalists. I'd documented every instance meticulously, gathered comprehensive evidence, and planned my response with the precision I brought to software development. Because what neither Ryan nor these investors knew was that I'd already incorporated my own company, filed patents on the core algorithms Ryan thought we owned together, and secured commitments from our 3 best engineers to join my venture. I'd also been approached by 2 major tech companies interested in acquiring the intellectual property Ryan was currently presenting as his vision. In 72 hours, I would resign from the company and reveal that every line of production code Ryan had been demonstrating was actually my work, protected by patents and copyrights he didn't know I'd secured. His company would be left with no technical foundation, no engineering talent, and potential legal liability. Mine would launch with the technology he'd tried to steal, proper attribution, and acquisition offers worth millions. Before we witness how a brilliant software engineer whose code was stolen for years used legal strategy and industry connections to destroy her co-founder while launching her own successful startup, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes intellectual property theft deserves the same consequences as any other stealing, and that code plagiarism should be exposed publicly. If you've had your technical work stolen, if you've watched co-founders take credit for your engineering, if you've been the invisible developer behind someone else's startup success, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and strategic planning overcome exploitation in tech. Now let's step into the world of Silicon Valley, where a talented engineer's code was systematically stolen by her charismatic co-founder, where startup culture enabled exploitation, and where 20 months of careful preparation created the foundation for complete professional destruction and technical triumph. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a 31-year-old software engineer originally from Seattle, Washington. I grew up in a tech-focused household where my father worked as a systems architect at Microsoft and my mother was a computer science professor at the University of Washington. Programming wasn't just a career path in my family, it was a native language. I learned to code when I was 8 years old, sitting beside my father while he worked on personal projects at home. He taught me about algorithms, data structures, and the elegance of well-written code. By middle school, I was building my own applications and winning regional programming competitions. Technology felt like my natural element, the place where logic and creativity intersected perfectly. I earned a full scholarship to MIT, majoring in computer science with a focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence. College was intellectually thrilling, surrounded by brilliant students and professors pushing the boundaries of what technology could accomplish. I contributed to cutting-edge research projects, published papers in academic conferences, and graduated at the top of my class. My senior thesis involved developing a novel approach to natural language processing that significantly improved accuracy while reducing computational requirements. The work caught attention from several tech companies and research labs. Google offered me a position on their AI research team immediately after graduation, an exceptional opportunity for someone fresh out of undergrad. I spent 5 years at Google, working on machine learning infrastructure and contributing to projects that affected millions of users. The experience was invaluable for understanding how to build systems at massive scale, how to optimize for both performance and reliability, and how to collaborate with world-class engineers on complex technical challenges. But I felt creatively constrained by working on incremental improvements to existing products. I wanted to build something from scratch, to create new technology rather than just optimizing what already existed. I wanted the autonomy and impact that comes from founding your own company rather than being one engineer among thousands at a tech giant. At 28, I decided to leave Google and start my own company. I had strong technical skills, clear ideas about problems worth solving, and enough industry connections to make entrepreneurship feasible. What I didn't have was business expertise, fundraising experience, or the network of investor relationships that early-stage startups need to succeed. I met Ryan Chen at a tech networking event in San Francisco. He was 33, charismatic and articulate, with an MBA from Stanford and several years of experience in product management at successful startups. He approached me after hearing me describe my ideas about improving data processing efficiency for machine learning applications. Ryan said he'd been looking for a technical co-founder to build the kind of infrastructure company I was describing. He had connections to venture capital firms, understood startup business operations, and could handle everything from fundraising to hiring to business development. He said my engineering expertise combined with his business skills would create a formidable founding team. We formed DataStream Technologies as a 50-50 partnership, both our names on the incorporation documents as co-founders. Ryan led our first fundraising round, securing $500,000 in seed funding from angel investors in his network. We rented office space in the financial district, hired 2 junior engineers, and began building the product I'd architected. The early months felt productive and exciting. I wrote code and designed system architecture while Ryan handled business planning and investor relations. I spent 12 to 14-hour days building the core technology, creating algorithms that would become our competitive advantage. Ryan would check in regularly to see progress, always enthusiastic about the technical capabilities I was developing. I shared everything with Ryan during this development phase, walking him through my code, explaining technical decisions, describing the innovations that made our approach superior to competing solutions. I thought we were co-founders building something together, that my openness about technical details was normal collaboration between engineering and business leadership. The theft started subtly during our investor updates. Ryan would describe technical capabilities to investors using language that subtly claimed credit for engineering work. He'd say, "We developed," or "our innovation," when discussing algorithms I'd created entirely on my own. He'd present architecture diagrams without clearly stating that I'd designed every component. At first, I told myself this was normal startup communication, that Ryan was using inclusive language to present us as a unified founding team. But the pattern became more troubling when he started taking pitch meetings without inviting me, returning with stories about how impressed investors were with his technical vision and his innovative approach to data processing. The first undeniable instance involved our core algorithm for distributed data processing, which I'd spent 6 months developing and optimizing. The algorithm was technically complex, representing genuine innovation in how to handle certain types of machine learning workloads efficiently. It was the foundation of our entire product value proposition. I'd walked Ryan through the algorithm's logic in detail during a technical review session, explaining the mathematical principles and implementation strategies that made it work. 2 weeks later, a tech journalist published a profile article about DataStream. The article described Ryan as the technical visionary behind the company, quoted him extensively about his algorithm for distributed processing, and mentioned me only briefly as an engineer helping implement his vision. When I confronted Ryan about the article, he seemed surprised that I was upset. He said the journalist had misunderstood his comments, that he'd talked about our technology and the reporter had focused on him as the CEO and public face of the company. He said I was being overly sensitive about attribution, that what mattered was getting good publicity for the startup regardless of who the press quoted. The gaslighting was subtle and effective. Ryan made me feel like I was being petty about credit when I should be grateful for any positive press coverage. He suggested that successful startups required business co-founders to be public faces while technical co-founders focused on building rather than publicity. He implied that my concern about attribution reflected insecurity rather than legitimate complaint about erasure. But the pattern continued and intensified over the following months. Ryan scheduled meetings with potential customers, tech journalists, and new investors without including me, presenting himself as the technical architect behind DataStream. When I insisted on attending meetings, he'd dominate technical conversations, describing algorithms and system design in ways that claimed ownership of work I'd done. During one particularly frustrating investor pitch, Ryan used a slide deck I'd never seen before that included technical diagrams of my architecture alongside text describing Ryan Chen's innovative approach to distributed machine learning. Every diagram showed systems I'd designed, every optimization technique came from my code, every innovation reflected my engineering work. But Ryan's name was prominently displayed as the technical founder. I was sitting right there during this pitch, watching 3 potential Series A investors take notes about Ryan's technical philosophy and his engineering innovations. One investor asked Ryan a specific question about how our algorithm handled certain edge cases. Ryan answered confidently, describing approaches I'd implemented as if they were his own ideas. When the meeting ended, I confronted Ryan directly about claiming my engineering work as his innovation. He looked at me with apparent confusion, as if my anger was incomprehensible. He said that as co-founders of the company, all intellectual property was ours, regardless of who physically wrote the code. He said I was being territorial about work that belonged to the company we'd built together. The conversation escalated into an argument about ownership, credit, and what co-founder partnership meant. Ryan insisted that his fundraising efforts and business leadership were equally valuable to my code development, that the company's success was collaborative even if I'd physically built the technology. He said demanding individual credit for code undermined our partnership and made me seem difficult to work with. I left that meeting feeling manipulated and angry. Ryan had taken a legitimate complaint about intellectual property theft and reframed it as my personal problem with sharing recognition. He'd made me question whether I was being unreasonable to expect acknowledgement for creating every line of production code he was claiming as his innovation. That night, I called my father and described what was happening. He listened carefully, then told me something crucial. He said that in his 30 years in tech, he'd seen this pattern repeatedly. Business co-founders claiming credit for engineering work, technical people being kept invisible while charismatic leaders built reputations on code they didn't write. He said it often ended badly for the engineers unless they protected themselves legally and strategically. My father suggested I immediately consult with both an intellectual property attorney and a startup lawyer about protecting my work and understanding my rights. He said that if Ryan was systematically claiming credit for my code, I needed documentation and legal protection before the situation escalated further. Following my father's advice, I consulted with attorneys who specialized in tech startup IP issues. They reviewed our incorporation documents and found significant problems with how intellectual property was addressed. The documents said the company owned all code developed by founders, but they didn't clearly define attribution, didn't specify what happened if the partnership dissolved, and didn't protect individual rights to technical innovations. The attorneys explained that while the company nominally owned my code, I potentially had strong claims to individual intellectual property rights because I'd created everything and Ryan had contributed no technical work. They recommended immediately filing provisional patents on my core algorithms and documenting comprehensively that all technical work was mine. The documentation would be crucial if disputes arose later about who actually created the technology. Most importantly, they explained that I could potentially leave the company and take my technical knowledge with me, as long as I didn't use the exact code I'd written for DataStream. The fundamental algorithms and approaches I'd developed were in my head, and I could implement them differently for a new venture without violating any agreements. Ryan would be left with code he couldn't understand or maintain without me. This legal consultation changed my understanding of the situation completely. I wasn't trapped in an exploitative partnership. I had options, legal protections, and the ability to build the same technology independently without Ryan. His claim that the company owned my innovations was true for the specific implementation but not for the underlying knowledge and approaches I'd created. I began executing a careful strategy to document my work and prepare for potentially leaving DataStream. I started keeping detailed engineering logs describing every algorithm I developed, every optimization I implemented, every technical decision I made. I dated everything carefully and backed up my documentation in multiple secure locations, including personal cloud storage Ryan couldn't access. I also filed provisional patent applications on 3 core algorithms that were the foundation of our technology. The provisional applications gave me 12 months to file full patents while establishing priority dates proving I'd invented the algorithms. The applications were filed under my name individually, not under the company, based on my attorney's advice about protecting my intellectual property independently. Simultaneously, I began building relationships with engineers and other tech professionals independent of Ryan and DataStream. I attended technical conferences alone, presented at engineering meetups about my work, and made sure people in the tech community knew me as the actual engineer behind DataStream's technology. I was establishing my own professional identity and reputation. During one conference, I presented a technical talk about distributed data processing that included some of the innovations I'd implemented at DataStream. The talk was well received, and several attendees approached me afterward to discuss the technical details. Multiple people expressed surprise that I was the CTO of DataStream, saying they'd gotten the impression from press coverage that Ryan was the technical founder. Those conversations confirmed that Ryan's credit theft wasn't just affecting my relationship with him, it was damaging my professional reputation in the broader tech community. People thought he was the engineering brain behind our company when in reality he barely understood the code I'd written. The misattribution would affect my career long-term unless I corrected it decisively. I also started quietly reaching out to DataStream's engineering team about my concerns. Our 3 engineers all reported directly to me and worked with my code daily. They knew I'd written everything and that Ryan's technical understanding was superficial. When I mentioned that I was concerned about Ryan taking credit for engineering work, all 3 confirmed they'd noticed the pattern and found it troubling. One engineer, James Park, told me he'd almost left the company because he found Ryan's behavior toward technical staff dismissive and his claims about technical contributions dishonest. James said he'd stayed primarily because he respected my engineering work and wanted to learn from me. But he'd been considering other opportunities because the company culture under Ryan's leadership felt toxic. This conversation revealed that Ryan's exploitation wasn't just affecting me but was creating broader problems with engineering team morale and retention. If I left, our best engineers would probably leave too, recognizing that Ryan couldn't build or maintain the technology without my leadership. The company would collapse technically without me. That realization gave me additional leverage and confidence. Ryan thought he was building a valuable company on my code, but the company's value was entirely dependent on my continued presence and technical contributions. If I left strategically and took the engineering team, Ryan would be left with a company that had no technology, no technical talent, and no ability to deliver on promises he'd made to investors. The breakthrough in my strategy came when I was approached by 2 major tech companies interested in acquiring DataStream. Both companies were specifically interested in our data processing technology, the algorithms and architecture I'd created. The acquisition conversations made clear that our company's entire value was in the IP I'd developed. During these acquisition discussions, I realized I could potentially sell my technology directly to acquirers after leaving DataStream, rather than staying and letting Ryan profit from my work while continuing to claim credit. The acquirers wanted the technology and the engineer who'd created it, not the business structure or the CEO who'd raised funding. I started having preliminary conversations with both potential acquirers about a different structure, instead of acquiring DataStream, they could potentially acquire a new company I'd form with the same technical capabilities. I explained the IP situation carefully, noting that I'd created all the technology and could implement similar approaches in a new company without using DataStream-specific code. Both companies expressed interest in this alternative structure. They wanted my technical knowledge and engineering talent, not Ryan's business leadership. One company, a major cloud services provider, indicated they'd be willing to offer between $8 and $12 million for my technology plus employment contracts for me and any engineers who joined me. This acquisition interest gave me a clear exit strategy. I could leave DataStream, immediately form a new company, implement my algorithms in cleanroom fashion, bring over our engineering team, and sell to a major acquirer within months. I'd receive full credit for my work, proper compensation for my technology, and escape from Ryan's exploitation. But executing this strategy required extremely careful planning and timing. I needed to resign from DataStream in a way that didn't violate any agreements, implement my technology fresh without using any DataStream code, and move quickly enough that Ryan couldn't interfere or try to claim rights to my new company. I worked with my attorneys for 3 months preparing every detail of the exit strategy. We drafted resignation documents, incorporation papers for my new company, employment agreements for engineers who join me, and patent applications for my algorithms. Everything was ready to execute simultaneously when I chose the timing. The trigger for execution came when Ryan scheduled a major Series A pitch to close our next funding round. He'd been working on this fundraising for months, and the pitch would determine whether DataStream could raise the $10 million needed to scale operations. Ryan was planning to present our technical capabilities as his vision to close the funding. I decided that pitch meeting would be the last time Ryan would present my technology as his innovation. 72 hours before the Series A pitch, I would resign, announce my new company, and reveal that all the technology Ryan was about to present to investors was my work, now protected by patents he had no rights to. The timing would devastate Ryan's fundraising, leave investors questioning everything they'd been told about DataStream's technical foundation, and establish me as the actual creator of valuable technology. It was the perfect moment to expose his systematic theft while maximizing consequences and positioning my own success. The day I'd chosen to execute arrived on a Wednesday morning. I'd rehearsed every step, prepared all documents, and coordinated with the engineers who'd agreed to join my new company. Everything was ready. I arrived at our office at 9 a.m. with my resignation letter and supporting documentation. Ryan was in his office on a video call with an investor, discussing the upcoming Series A pitch. He saw me through his glass office wall and waved cheerfully, giving me a thumbs up about the pitch preparation. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. I waited for his call to end, then knocked on his door. He invited me in with a smile, asking if I'd finalized the technical demo for the investor pitch. His casual confidence, his complete lack of awareness that he was about to lose everything, made what I was about to do feel entirely justified. Actually, Ryan, I need to tell you something important, I said, placing my resignation letter on his desk. I'm resigning from DataStream effective immediately. This letter is my formal notice. Ryan's smile disappeared instantly, replaced by confusion and shock. He picked up the letter and read it quickly, his face going from confused to pale to angry in seconds. What the hell, Sarah? We have the Series A pitch in 3 days. You can't resign right now. This is completely unprofessional and frankly sabotage. I can resign, and I am. I'm also notifying you that I've filed patents on the core algorithms that run our technology, patents filed in my name individually. You'll find that DataStream has no rights to my intellectual property, which means you have no technology to pitch to investors on Friday. Ryan stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall. That's insane. You can't patent company IP. Everything you built belongs to DataStream. I'll sue you for theft and breach of contract. You can try, but you'll lose. My attorneys have reviewed every document carefully. The incorporation papers don't properly assign IP rights to the company, and more importantly, I can prove I created everything with no technical contribution from you. The patents are mine, Ryan. The technology is mine. And you're about to face investors with a company that has no product. Ryan's face flushed red with anger. This is because of the press coverage, isn't it? You're upset that journalists focus on me as CEO. That's how startups work, Sarah. The business leader is the public face. You need to get over your ego about attribution. The accusation was stunning in its projection and dismissiveness. Ryan had spent 20 months systematically claiming credit for my engineering work, and now he was framing my objection as ego and oversensitivity. But I'd prepared for exactly this response. This isn't about press coverage or ego. It's about you repeatedly claiming you created technology that I built. It's about you telling investors, my algorithm, and my innovation, when describing code you didn't write and barely understand. It's about systematic theft of credit for technical work that's entirely mine. I have comprehensive documentation proving everything I'm saying. No one is going to believe you. Every article about DataStream mentions me as the technical visionary. Every investor pitch has my name on the technical slides. Your word against documented reality won't get you anywhere. Those articles and slides document your fraud, not reality. And I have evidence proving the fraud. I have dated engineering logs, version control history, patent applications, and witness statements from our engineering team confirming I created everything. You have no technical knowledge, no code contributions, and no legitimate claim to the IP you've been presenting as yours. Ryan moved around his desk toward me, his body language aggressive. If you do this, I will destroy you in tech. I have connections throughout Silicon Valley. I'll make sure no one ever hires you or funds your companies. I'll tell everyone you're unstable, that you stole from your co-founder, that you're impossible to work with. The threats were predictable and ultimately empty. Tech companies cared about technical talent and provable capabilities, not about a failed CEO's stories about a former co-founder. And I had evidence that would make Ryan's claims obviously false. You can try to damage my reputation, but it won't work. I have too much evidence of your credit theft, too many people who know I created the technology you've been claiming. I also have acquisition offers from major companies who want my technology and don't care about your version of events. You're the one facing a destroyed reputation, Ryan, not me. I picked up my laptop bag and turned toward the door. Ryan grabbed my arm, not violently but firmly enough to stop me. I looked at his hand on my arm, then directly at his face. Remove your hand right now, or I'll call security and file an assault report. You've stolen credit from me for 20 months. Don't compound it by adding physical intimidation. Ryan released my arm immediately, stepping back with his hands raised. He looked desperate, finally understanding that his entire company was collapsing and he had no power to prevent it. Sarah, please. We can work this out. I'll give you more equity. I'll make sure you get credit going forward. Don't destroy everything we've built. You destroyed it by systematically stealing credit for my work. I'm not interested in working out anything. I'm leaving, I'm taking my technology, and you're going to face the consequences of building a company on stolen intellectual property. Good luck with your Series A pitch on Friday. I hope you've learned enough about distributed data processing to present it yourself, since you won't be showing my work anymore. I walked out of Ryan's office for the last time, leaving him standing in shock. 3 engineers looked up from their desks as I passed through the office. I'd already told them I was leaving and invited them to join my new company. All 3 nodded at me with expressions that combined sympathy and determination. They'd be resigning within the hour. Within 2 hours of my resignation, I'd executed the rest of my plan. My attorneys sent formal notices to DataStream and its investors explaining that I owned the IP Ryan had been presenting as company technology. I announced the formation of my new company, Stream Tech Solutions, with patent-pending technology for distributed machine learning. I published a technical blog post explaining my algorithms and firmly attributing the innovations to myself. The tech media response was immediate and intense. Multiple journalists contacted me within hours, having heard about the DataStream dissolution and wanting to understand what happened. I provided interviews explaining Ryan's systematic credit theft, showing documentation of my technical work, and describing my decision to leave rather than continue being exploited. Several tech journalists had suspected something was wrong with the Ryan Chen story. They'd noticed he couldn't answer detailed technical questions and seemed to lack the deep engineering knowledge his public persona claimed. My revelations confirmed their suspicions and gave them a compelling story about credit theft in startups. TechCrunch published an article titled, "When Business Co-Founders Steal Credit, the DataStream Collapse," that detailed Ryan's theft and my strategic exit. The article included screenshots of my engineering commits, timestamps proving I'd written all the code, and expert analysis confirming my technical claims were legitimate. The story went viral in Silicon Valley circles. The Series A pitch Ryan had scheduled became a complete disaster. By Friday, all 3 investors he'd been pitching had withdrawn from the process after learning about my resignation and IP claims. None wanted to invest in a company with no technology and potential legal liability. The pitch meeting was cancelled entirely. DataStream's seed investors immediately began demanding answers about the technical foundation of their investment. When Ryan couldn't explain the technology or produce evidence he'd contributed technically, several investors threatened to sue for fraud. The company's valuation collapsed overnight from projected $20 million post-Series A to essentially zero. Ryan tried to hire other engineers to rebuild the technology, but no talented engineer wanted to work for someone publicly exposed for stealing credit. The few candidates willing to interview demanded enormous salaries and equity, recognizing Ryan's desperate position. Without the ability to recruit technical talent, DataStream had no path forward. Meanwhile, Stream Tech Solutions was launching successfully. I'd hired DataStream's 3 best engineers, all of whom were thrilled to work with me directly without Ryan's exploitation. We worked intensely for 8 weeks implementing cleanroom versions of my algorithms, writing completely new code that achieved the same technical goals through the approaches I'd developed. The cleanroom implementation was legally crucial. I couldn't use any code I'd written for DataStream, but I could implement the same algorithms and approaches using my knowledge and different code. It was like a musician performing the same song with different instruments and arrangement. The underlying composition was mine regardless of the specific implementation. Both acquirers I'd been speaking with remained interested despite the drama with DataStream. The cloud services company made a formal offer, $12 million for Stream Tech Solutions plus employment contracts for me and my team. The acquisition was specifically for my technical knowledge and the engineering team I'd assembled. I accepted the acquisition offer 3 months after leaving DataStream. $12 million for a company I'd incorporated 12 weeks earlier represented extraordinary validation of my technical work. More importantly, the acquisition made clear that my value was in my engineering capabilities and intellectual contributions, not in Ryan's business leadership or investor relationships. The acquisition terms included significant ongoing compensation for me as a technical leader at the acquiring company. I'd continue working on distributed machine learning technology, but now with proper attribution, appropriate compensation, and institutional support. And I'd be known throughout tech as the engineer who'd created valuable technology and successfully fought back against credit theft. Ryan's attempts to salvage DataStream failed completely. Without technology and without technical talent, the company couldn't deliver on promises Ryan had made to investors and customers. 6 months after my departure, DataStream shut down entirely, returning whatever remained of seed investor money after paying off obligations. The failure was covered extensively in tech media as a cautionary tale about non-technical founders claiming credit for engineering work they didn't do. Ryan's name became synonymous in Silicon Valley with founder fraud and IP theft. Several articles specifically mentioned that he'd lost a $12 million acquisition opportunity by exploiting and alienating his technical co-founder. Ryan tried to start another company 2 years later, but his reputation was too damaged. Investors wouldn't back him after the DataStream fraud. Engineers wouldn't work with him knowing his history of stealing credit. Even business development contacts avoided him, not wanting their own reputations tainted by association with someone known for systematic exploitation. His career in tech was effectively over, ended by his own credit theft and the public exposure of his fraud. Meanwhile, I was thriving at the acquiring company, leading machine learning infrastructure projects and receiving appropriate recognition for my technical contributions. 3 years after the DataStream exit, I'm 34 years old and a senior engineering leader at a major tech company, working on cutting-edge machine learning systems that affect millions of users. I've published research papers, presented at major conferences, and built a reputation as an expert in distributed data processing. All with proper attribution for work I actually did. The experience with Ryan taught me crucial lessons about protecting technical work and the importance of legal rights, documentation, and strategic planning when facing IP theft. I learned that confronting exploitation directly is often ineffective when business partners are manipulative, and that sometimes the best response is building independent success while exposing fraud through evidence. I've become an advocate for technical founders facing credit theft, speaking at engineering conferences and startup events about protecting intellectual property. I share my story openly, explaining how business co-founders sometimes steal credit for technical work and what engineers can do legally to protect themselves. I occasionally see Ryan's name mentioned in tech community discussions, always in connection with the DataStream credit theft scandal. He never recovered professionally from the public exposure of his fraud. He's unemployable in startups and unable to attract funding or partnerships. Meanwhile, I'm succeeding with proper recognition for my work, building technology that matters, and mentoring other engineers about protecting their intellectual contributions. The career Ryan tried to build on my stolen code never materialized, while mine has flourished with appropriate attribution. If this story resonates with you, if you've had your technical work stolen by co-founders or business partners, remember that patents and copyrights matter, documentation is essential, and legal protection can overcome exploitation. File provisional patents on your core innovations. Keep detailed engineering logs with dates and descriptions. Build your reputation independent of exploitative partnerships. Hit subscribe to join our community that believes intellectual property theft deserves exposure and consequences. Share this with someone whose code or technical work is being exploited by business partners who won't give proper credit. And remember that the best response to IP theft combines legal protection with strategic positioning and eventual public exposure of fraud. The engineer whose code was stolen for 20 months secured a $12 million acquisition for her technology while her co-founder's company collapsed. The co-founder who claimed credit for engineering he didn't do became unemployable in tech. And the algorithms that were stolen were properly attributed, creating success for their actual creator. Sometimes justice requires patience and strategic preparation rather than immediate confrontation. Sometimes protecting your work means leaving exploitative partnerships and building independently. Sometimes the best revenge is succeeding dramatically while the exploiter faces complete professional destruction. Ryan thought he could build a valuable startup on my stolen code because tech culture often enables such exploitation through power dynamics and attribution ambiguity. He was catastrophically wrong. His victim documented systematically, secured legal protections, built independent success, and exposed his fraud to everyone who mattered in Silicon Valley. The invisible engineer became a recognized technical leader. The stolen code was properly attributed and acquired for millions. The exploiter became discredited and unemployable. And tech learned that IP theft, even theft disguised as co-founder collaboration, would eventually be exposed by engineers who refused to stay invisible. The acquisition by the cloud services company transformed not just my financial situation but my entire professional trajectory. $12 million was extraordinary wealth for someone who'd been a salaried engineer just months before. But more meaningful than the money was the institutional validation that my technology was genuinely valuable and that I was the actual creator of innovations Ryan had tried to claim. The acquiring company, which I'll call Cloud Tech, brought me in as a distinguished engineer, their highest individual contributor level. The title came with significant compensation, generous stock options, and the autonomy to work on projects I found technically interesting. I was leading a team of 15 engineers working on distributed machine learning infrastructure used by thousands of CloudTech's enterprise customers. What made the position particularly satisfying was the public nature of my technical leadership. CloudTech's culture emphasized recognizing and promoting individual technical contributors rather than just people managers. My work was publicly attributed in blog posts, technical papers, and conference presentations. The company actively built my professional brand as an expert in distributed computing and machine learning. The contrast with my experience at DataStream couldn't have been more stark. Ryan had systematically erased my visibility while claiming my innovations. CloudTech systematically increased my visibility while properly attributing my contributions. Every technical blog post I authored included my name and title prominently. Every conference talk I gave was promoted through company channels. Every patent I filed listed me clearly as the inventor. 6 months into my role at CloudTech, I published a technical paper describing the distributed data processing algorithms I'd originally developed at DataStream and then re-implemented at StreamTech. The paper was accepted to a top-tier computer science conference and received significant attention in the research community. Several researchers cited it as advancing the state-of-the-art in distributed computing. Ryan's name appeared nowhere in that paper because he'd contributed nothing technical to the work. The proper attribution of my innovations in a peer-reviewed academic publication created permanent record that I was the actual creator of technology he'd tried to steal. The paper would exist in academic literature forever, ensuring future recognition went to the right person. I also began speaking regularly at major technical conferences about distributed systems and machine learning infrastructure. CloudTech supported this external visibility, viewing it as both good for my professional development and good for the company's technical reputation. I spoke at events with thousands of attendees, establishing myself as a recognized expert in my field. During one conference keynote, I was introduced as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, distinguished engineer at CloudTech and creator of innovations in distributed machine learning that have been widely adopted across the industry. The introduction accurately attributed my technical work and recognized me as the actual innovator. Hearing that public recognition felt like complete vindication after years of having Ryan claim credit for my engineering. After my keynote, multiple people approached me to discuss my work. Several mentioned they'd previously thought the DataStream algorithms were Ryan Chen's innovations based on press coverage and his investor pitches. They said learning the real story about who actually created the technology had changed their understanding of both my technical capabilities and Ryan's fraudulent claims. One conversation particularly stuck with me. A young woman engineer described facing similar credit theft from her technical co-founder at an early-stage startup. She said hearing my story gave her courage to document her work and consult with attorneys about protecting her IP. She was planning to leave her company and start fresh with proper legal protections, following the strategy I'd used successfully. I spent an hour advising her on specific steps: filing provisional patents, keeping detailed engineering logs, building independent professional reputation, and timing her exit strategically. 6 months later, she emailed to say she'd left her startup, started her own company with the engineers who'd worked under her, and secured acquisition interest from 2 major tech companies. My experience had helped her achieve similar successful outcome. Those conversations with engineers facing credit theft became increasingly frequent as my story spread through Silicon Valley. I started receiving regular emails from technical founders describing exploitation by business co-founders who claimed credit for engineering work. The situations were remarkably similar across companies, suggesting systematic patterns rather than isolated incidents. The common thread in these stories involved business-focused co-founders leveraging their communication skills and investor relationships to become the public face of companies while systematically erasing technical co-founders' contributions. The exploitation was enabled by tech culture that often values charismatic pitching over actual engineering, by journalists who defaulted to interviewing CEOs rather than CTOs, and by investors who sometimes didn't verify who actually created the technology they were funding. Recognizing these patterns, I started organizing informal support groups for technical founders dealing with credit theft or considering leaving exploitative partnerships. We'd meet monthly at a coffee shop in San Francisco, sharing experiences and advice. The groups typically included 5 to 8 engineers, mostly women and underrepresented minorities who faced compounded challenges from both credit theft and broader tech industry discrimination. These gatherings felt like creating the support system I wish I'd had when starting DataStream with Ryan. If other technical founders had warned me about credit theft risks, helped me understand IP law, and advised me on protecting my work from the beginning, maybe I could have prevented Ryan's exploitation or addressed it earlier. The groups provided that preventive education and strategic advice to others. Several engineers who participated in these groups successfully left exploitative partnerships, started their own companies, and secured acquisitions or funding with proper attribution. Each success story validated the approach I'd used and proved that escaping credit theft was achievable with proper planning and support. The visibility of these successful exits started changing conversations in Silicon Valley about co-founder dynamics and intellectual property. Investors began asking more probing questions about who actually created technology before funding companies. Tech journalists began verifying technical claims rather than just accepting whatever founders told them. The culture was shifting slightly toward more careful attribution. My advocacy work extended beyond informal support groups to more formal efforts at institutional change. I joined the board of a nonprofit focused on supporting women in tech, specifically working on their resources for women founders facing discrimination or exploitation. We developed legal guides, template IP agreements, and educational materials about protecting technical contributions in startup partnerships. The nonprofit work connected me with tech lawyers specializing in founder disputes and IP conflicts. Together we created model co-founder agreements that properly protected technical founders' intellectual property while enabling legitimate business partnerships. The agreements explicitly defined who owned which innovations, how credit would be attributed publicly, and what happened to IP if partnerships dissolved. These model agreements represented the contracts I wish Ryan and I had signed when forming DataStream. If we'd clearly defined IP ownership and attribution requirements at the beginning, his credit theft might have been prevented or at least would have been clearer violation of explicit terms. The model agreements we created would help other technical founders avoid my experience. CloudTech also promoted me internally to lead our efforts around responsible AI and algorithmic fairness, recognizing that my technical expertise combined with my advocacy experience made me well suited for addressing ethical issues in machine learning systems. The role involved both technical work on fairness algorithms and policy work on how tech companies should govern AI development. The expansion into AI ethics felt like natural extension of my advocacy around credit theft and attribution. Both involved questions about whose knowledge and contributions got recognized, whose interests were protected, and how power dynamics in tech affected whose voices mattered. Fighting for proper attribution of my own work and fighting for fairness in AI systems came from similar principles about recognizing and respecting people's contributions. I published several papers on algorithmic fairness that gained significant attention in both academic and industry circles. The work combined technical rigor with social awareness, addressing how machine learning systems could perpetuate or amplify existing inequalities if designed without careful attention to fairness. CloudTech used this research to improve their ML products and to establish themselves as leaders in responsible AI development. My professional reputation grew to include both technical innovation and ethical leadership. I was recognized as someone who not only built sophisticated systems but thought carefully about their social implications. Conference organizers invited me to keynote on topics ranging from distributed computing to AI ethics to women's leadership in tech. 4 years after leaving DataStream, I'd become one of the more visible technical leaders in Silicon Valley, known for engineering excellence, innovation in distributed systems, advocacy for technical founders, and thought leadership on AI ethics. The comprehensive professional identity felt like the complete opposite of the invisibility Ryan had tried to impose on me. Ryan's attempt to keep me invisible while stealing my work had completely backfired. His exploitation had motivated me to fight for visibility and proper attribution not just for myself but for others facing similar theft. His fraud had catalyzed my becoming a more prominent voice and advocate than I might have become if simply left alone to build technology without facing systematic credit theft. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ryan had wanted to build his reputation on my work while keeping me invisible. Instead, his theft had made me far more visible and influential than him, while his own reputation was destroyed by exposure of his fraud. The exploitation that was meant to suppress my success had ultimately amplified it. I occasionally wondered what Ryan was doing professionally after DataStream's collapse. I'd heard through tech industry contacts that he'd tried consulting work and fractional executive roles at startups, but his damaged reputation made sustained success impossible. No serious startup wanted a CEO known for stealing credit from technical co-founders. One founder I knew had briefly considered hiring Ryan as an advisor before learning about the DataStream scandal. The founder told me that simply Googling Ryan's name revealed extensive coverage of the credit theft and company collapse. Any potential employer or partner could easily discover Ryan's history of exploitation, making him essentially unemployable in roles requiring trust or collaboration with technical teams. The permanent nature of reputational damage in the Internet age meant Ryan's credit theft would follow him indefinitely. Every article about the DataStream scandal remained searchable online. My public statements about his fraud were permanently archived. His name would forever be associated with founder exploitation and IP theft in Silicon Valley collective memory. That permanent reputational destruction felt like appropriate consequence for 20 months of systematic credit theft. Ryan had tried to build lasting success on my stolen work. Instead, he'd created lasting infamy through fraud that was thoroughly documented and publicly exposed. The reputational cost would affect him far longer than the immediate business failure of DataStream. My own professional trajectory continued upward. 5 years after the DataStream exit, CloudTech promoted me to Technical Fellow, the company's highest technical position held by fewer than 20 people globally. The promotion came with significant compensation increase, more autonomy, and expectation that I'd focus on long-term technical strategy and innovation rather than day-to-day engineering management. The Technical Fellow promotion represented extraordinary professional achievement, particularly for someone still in their mid-30s. Most people reaching that level were 2 decades into their careers at minimum. My rapid advancement was partly due to my technical capabilities but also due to my established reputation as innovator, my advocacy work, and my visibility as thought leader in AI ethics. CloudTech's public announcement of my promotion emphasized my technical innovations, my leadership in responsible AI, and my work supporting technical founders. The announcement positioned me as someone whose contributions extended beyond individual engineering work to broader influence on how tech development and founder relationships should work. The comprehensive recognition felt like complete validation after years of Ryan's exploitation and erasure. I also started angel investing in startups founded by technical women and underrepresented minorities, particularly those who'd left exploitative partnerships to build their own companies. My investments weren't just financial but included significant mentorship about IP protection, business strategy, and navigating Silicon Valley culture as a technical founder. Several of my angel investments became successful, generating strong financial returns while also supporting founders who might otherwise have struggled to secure funding. The investing activity felt like scaling my advocacy work, using my resources and experience to help more people succeed as technical founders with proper attribution. One particularly satisfying investment involved a black woman engineer who'd left a startup where her white male co-founder had systematically claimed credit for her machine learning work. She'd used strategies similar to mine, documenting her work carefully, filing patents, and leaving to start her own company. I invested in her seed round and helped her navigate acquisition discussions. Her company sold 18 months later for $25 million, creating significant wealth for her and validating her technical contributions. Her success demonstrated that my experience wasn't unique, that the combination of technical excellence, proper legal protection, and strategic planning could work for other engineers facing credit theft. Each successful outcome reinforced that exploitation could be overcome through preparation, documentation, and refusal to accept invisibility. The cumulative impact of my advocacy work, my professional success, my angel investing, and the model agreements and resources I'd helped create started genuinely changing conversations about technical founder treatment in Silicon Valley. More investors were asking detailed questions about who created technology before funding companies. More technical founders were filing provisional patents early. More startup lawyers were including strong IP protection clauses in co-founder agreements. The changes weren't revolutionary, and plenty of credit theft and exploitation still occurred in tech startups. But the awareness had increased that technical founders needed protection, that business co-founders shouldn't claim credit for engineering work, and that exploitation would face consequences if victims had documentation and legal rights. My very public successful fight against Ryan's theft had contributed to that cultural shift. 6 years after leaving DataStream, I published a book combining technical content about building distributed systems with practical advice about protecting intellectual property and navigating co-founder relationships. The book became a bestseller in tech business categories, widely adopted in computer science programs and startup accelerators. The book included detailed account of my experience with Ryan, using it as case study for how credit theft happens and how technical founders can protect themselves. The case study emphasized specific actions I'd taken: provisional patents, engineering logs, clean room implementation, strategic timing of exit. The practical advice helped other engineers implement similar protection strategies. Tech journalists reviewed the book positively, noting that it addressed important gaps in startup advice literature that typically focused on business aspects while ignoring technical founders' vulnerability to exploitation. Several reviews specifically mentioned the Ryan Chen case study as valuable cautionary tale about founder dynamics gone wrong. Ryan's role as cautionary tale villain in my best-selling book represented another layer of reputational consequence for his credit theft. His fraud was now immortalized in published literature, used to educate future generations of technical founders about protecting their work. He'd become the example of what not to do, the founder whose exploitation destroyed his own career while creating platform for his victims' success. My daughters, now 7 and 5, are growing up seeing their mother as a successful technologist, author, investor, and advocate. They understand in age-appropriate terms that I build things with code, help other people protect their work, and speak at events about technology and fairness. They're developing sense that women can be technical leaders and that standing up against unfair treatment is important. My older daughter already shows interest in programming, working through kid-friendly coding games and asking questions about how computers work. Watching her engage with technology naturally, without the gendered messages that discouraged previous generations of girls, feels like progress I'm glad to witness and support. I want both my daughters to understand that their contributions deserve recognition, that exploitation should be resisted, and that strategic planning combined with refusing to accept mistreatment can overcome power imbalances. The lessons from my experience with Ryan are applicable beyond tech to any situation where someone tries to claim credit for others' work. My father, who first advised me to protect my IP and document Ryan's exploitation, lived long enough to see my success at Cloud Tech and the publication of my book. He passed away 2 years ago from cancer, but before his death, he told me he was proud not just of my technical achievements but of how I'd used my experience to help other engineers avoid exploitation. His advice to immediately consult attorneys and start documentation when I first described Ryan's credit theft had been crucial to my successful exit strategy. Without that early legal protection and systematic record-keeping, exposing Ryan's fraud would have been much harder. My father's decades of tech experience had given him wisdom about founder dynamics that helped me respond effectively. Looking back at my career trajectory from Google engineer to DataStream co-founder to Ryan's exploitation to my acquisition success to my current role at CloudTech, I see a story about technical excellence combined with strategic thinking about protecting intellectual property and refusing to accept exploitation. Ryan tried to build his career on my stolen code, keeping me invisible while claiming my innovations. Instead, his systematic credit theft became the catalyst for my becoming far more visible, successful, and influential than him. His fraud motivated my advocacy work that's helped hundreds of other engineers protect their work and achieve proper recognition. The engineer Ryan tried to keep invisible became a technical fellow at a major tech company, published author, successful angel investor, and recognized advocate for technical founders. The code he tried to steal was properly attributed, acquired for millions, and implemented in systems affecting millions of users. The exploiter became permanently unemployable and discredited, known primarily as cautionary example of founder fraud. That's what happens when you steal from someone talented enough to create valuable technology independently, strategic enough to document systematically and protect their work legally, and determined enough to refuse invisibility while demanding proper attribution. You think you're building success on borrowed engineering genius. Actually, you're creating evidence and motivation for your own destruction while catalyzing your victim's rise to success you tried to prevent. Ryan learned that lesson too late to save his career or reputation. Silicon Valley learned it in time to implement better protections for technical founders. And I learned that surviving exploitation and achieving strategic vindication can transform individual injustice into catalyst for meaningful systemic change. The invisible engineer became visible and celebrated. The stolen code was correctly attributed and acquired. The exploiter was destroyed and discredited. And tech became slightly more just because one person refused to accept credit theft and responded with documentation, legal protection, strategic planning, and public exposure of fraud. 7 years after leaving DataStream, I'm 38 years old and at the peak of my career in tech. I lead a research group of 50 engineers at CloudTech working on next-generation distributed machine learning systems. I've published over 20 papers in top-tier computer science conferences. I've been granted 15 patents on innovations in distributed computing and machine learning infrastructure. And I'm recognized throughout the industry as a leader in both technical innovation and responsible AI development. The comprehensive professional success feels like complete vindication of my decision to leave Ryan's exploitation and build my career with proper attribution. Every published paper with my name on it, every patent listing me as inventor, every conference keynote introducing me accurately, every promotion recognizing my technical contributions, they all represent the visibility and credit Ryan tried to deny me. But the success that matters most isn't about my individual achievements. It's about the systemic changes that have made tech slightly better for technical founders, the engineers have helped escape exploitation, the resources have created to prevent future credit theft, and the cultural shifts toward better attribution practices. The model IP agreements I helped develop have been adopted by hundreds of startups, protecting technical founders from exploitation. The support groups I organized have helped dozens of engineers document credit theft and leave exploitative partnerships. The educational resources I've created have taught thousands of technical founders about protecting their intellectual property. These broader impacts transform my story from personal revenge narrative into something larger about using individual experience to catalyze systemic change. Ryan's credit theft affected me specifically, but my response has affected hundreds of people who've been able to protect their work and achieve proper recognition because of resources and advocacy emerging from my experience. When tech journalists write retrospectives about founder dynamics and IP protection in Silicon Valley, They frequently cite the DataStream case as inflection point when conversations about credit theft became more prominent. My public exposure of Ryan's fraud, combined with my successful acquisition and continued advocacy, created reference point for discussing these issues that hadn't existed before. The case appears in business school curricula as example of founder relationships gone wrong and importance of proper IP agreements. Law schools use it to teach about intellectual property protection in startup contexts. Computer science programs included in professional ethics courses about attribution and credit in collaborative technical work. Ryan's fraud has become teaching tool, his exploitation used to educate future generations about protecting technical contributions and treating co-founders fairly. He wanted to be remembered as successful technical entrepreneur. Instead, he's remembered as cautionary example of founder fraud, the person whose credit theft was so thoroughly documented and publicly exposed that it destroyed his career while elevating his victim. The permanent archival nature of his failure means Ryan will be associated with fraud indefinitely. Students reading case studies in business school decades from now will learn his name as example of what not to do. Engineers learning about IP protection will read about his credit theft as motivation for filing provisional patents. His attempted exploitation has become immortalized as cautionary tale. Meanwhile, my name is associated with technical innovation, advocacy for founder rights, leadership in responsible AI, and successful resistance to exploitation. The reputation I've built is comprehensive and positive, built on actual contributions rather than stolen credit. The contrast with Ryan's enduring negative reputation couldn't be more complete. I sometimes imagine what my career would have looked like if I'd never partnered with Ryan, if I'd started my company solo or found a co-founder who respected intellectual property and attribution. Would I have been as successful? Would I have become as prominent an advocate? Would I have been as motivated to help other technical founders? The counterfactual is unknowable, but I suspect Ryan's exploitation, despite its painfulness, catalyzed achievements and advocacy I might not have otherwise pursued. The injustice motivated me to fight not just for myself but for systemic change. The theft gave me credibility and platform for advocacy that helped many others. The fraud became foundation for positive impact extending beyond my individual career. That doesn't make Ryan's exploitation acceptable or justified. He caused real harm through his systematic credit theft, and he deserves all the professional consequences he faced. But I can acknowledge that my response to his exploitation created positive outcomes beyond just personal vindication. 8 years after DataStream's dissolution, I announced my departure from CloudTech to start a venture capital firm focused exclusively on funding technical founders, particularly women and underrepresented minorities who'd left exploitative partnerships. The VC firm, called Attribution Ventures, would combine capital with intensive IP protection support, legal resources, and mentorship about building companies with proper credit culture. The firm's name explicitly referenced my core advocacy issue: ensuring proper attribution for technical contributions. Our investment thesis emphasized backing exceptional technical founders who demonstrated both engineering excellence and courage to leave situations where their work wasn't properly recognized. We were betting on people who valued attribution enough to risk career security to achieve it. Attribution Ventures' first fund raised $50 million from limited partners who shared my values about supporting technical founders and promoting better attribution practices in startups. Several of my limited partners were successful tech entrepreneurs who'd witnessed or experienced credit theft in their own careers and wanted to support better practices. The first company we funded was led by a black woman engineer who'd left a startup where her co-founder had systematically claimed credit for her technical work. She'd used strategies directly inspired by my DataStream experience, and Attribution Ventures provided both capital and comprehensive IP protection support. Her company raised a strong Series A round 18 months later, and she's building a successful business with proper recognition for her engineering work. That investment felt like scaling my advocacy to new level, using significant capital to back engineers fighting for proper attribution while providing resources that made their fights more likely to succeed. Each Attribution Ventures investment represented another technical founder who'd receive support I wished I'd had when starting with Ryan. The venture firm's existence and investment strategy sent strong signal to tech industry about importance of attribution and consequences for credit theft. Founders who'd exploited technical partners would find it harder to raise future funding, knowing that credible investors were explicitly supporting their victims. The market dynamics were shifting slightly toward protecting rather than enabling exploitation. My transition from employee to venture capitalist felt like natural evolution of my career arc from individual contributor to technical leader to advocate to investor using capital to support systemic change. Each phase built on previous experiences, with Ryan's exploitation serving as origin story that motivated everything that followed. 9 years after leaving DataStream, I received invitation to keynote a major startup conference on topic of founder dynamics and intellectual property protection. The conference organizers specifically requested that I discuss my experience with Ryan and lessons for current founders. The keynote would be attended by thousands of startup founders, investors, and service providers. I accepted the invitation and prepared a presentation that combined personal story with practical advice and data about credit theft patterns in tech. The presentation included detailed account of Ryan's systematic exploitation, my documentation and legal strategy, the successful acquisition outcome, and resources I'd created to help other technical founders. The keynote received standing ovation and generated extensive social media discussion. Hundreds of technical founders contacted me after the presentation to share their own experiences with credit theft and thank me for public advocacy. Several mentioned they were implementing documentation strategies I'd described to protect their own work. Ryan's name trended on Twitter that evening, not because of anything he'd done but because my keynote had reminded thousands of people about his fraud. The renewed attention to DataStream scandal was entirely negative for him, cementing his reputation as cautionary example while elevating my profile as advocate and success story. 10 years after leaving DataStream, the company that had tried to claim my work was completely forgotten except as footnote in my success story. Ryan had faded into obscurity, his career destroyed by exploitation that backfired catastrophically. And I was at peak of influence and success, using my platform to continue fighting for technical founders' rights and proper attribution in tech industry. The decade-long arc from exploitation to vindication to advocacy to venture capital represented complete transformation of individual injustice into catalyst for broader change. Ryan had tried to steal my success, and instead his theft had become foundation for success exceeding anything he'd imagined while motivating changes that protected hundreds of other technical founders. The invisible engineer he'd tried to suppress became one of tech industry's most visible advocates for founder rights. The code he'd tried to steal became properly attributed and implemented in systems affecting millions. The exploitation he'd inflicted became teaching case helping future generations protect their work. And the exploiter became permanently discredited cautionary example. That's the ultimate outcome when exploitation meets someone talented enough to succeed independently, strategic enough to document and plan carefully, and committed enough to transform personal justice into advocacy benefiting many others. The stolen credit was restored. The fraud was exposed. The exploiter was destroyed. And the tech industry became measurably better because one person refused to accept invisible exploitation and fought back with documentation, legal strategy, and eventual systemic advocacy.